God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
All right. For those who are watching at home, sometime along the line, we've read from Proverbs, chapter 22. We've read from James 2, starting at the first verse, and Mark 7, 24 to 37. A lot of rich material there for a preacher, plus the psalm. But there seems to be, to me, a theme that runs through all the lessons. And the theme is one that makes our faith heritage stand out in the whole of human history in a way that's still being played out. Because I want you to hear some of the themes of what, as the elect people of God, the chosen ones, the ones who, for whatever reason, most people all feel chosen by whatever religion they're in, but the chosen people of Yahweh, of El, of the one that is revealed through the centuries of experience in Hebrew scripture that's represented there, all of that, predating Jesus, is demanding something called justice. And what is meant by that is this idea of every person stands equal, at least before God. May not be equal in any way in human society, but when it comes to the point of facing God, everyone's equal. Now, there seems to be all these ways that people like to make distinctions to actually imply or overtly say that people shouldn't be equal. Either they say they shouldn't be equal before God because they have set themselves up as judges of who has received what from God and who lives in the right way with God. There are all those who make their careers on that. It's an easy job because people mess up all the time. If you're going to be the judge, all you have to do is point at everybody else and all their failings and put yourself apart. So we know that there's that kind of religious response. But that's not the response in Scripture. It's not the response called for over and over throughout the prophets that there be justice. And justice means a lot of different things in Jewish law. In fact, Jewish law developed in order to try to make a just society. My big old bull goes through an unrepaired part of my fence and gores your cow, then the person who lost their cow needs to have, if I'm not already honorable enough to say I'm going to pay for your cow, it's that person's ability to go to some authority to redress their loss. And if you ever get into the weeds of Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Bible, that all of you have said, I'm going to read the whole Bible. This year I'm going to do it. And somewhere in Leviticus or Deuteronomy, you just die on the vine with that particular one because you're in all these weeds about all these details. That's because it was law for living. It wasn't just a hypothetical, if the world was perfect, this is what it would be. Jewish law is meant to help people live with each other in such a way that those who will inevitably gain more power and more wealth can't use that to oppress those who don't. This is part of our heritage. This is part of our faith heritage, that there is justice with God. You see, justice for humans in the Jewish tradition descends as the Ten Commandments, right? That's the story, that's the symbolic story of the giving of the law. But, 10 wasn't enough. That's why there's a big, long Old Testament. But it begins there, that they will be a people governed by law. And that law has divine origins, and that law should reflect a couple of things. It should reflect the perfect love and mercy and the perfect judgment of God. And it recognizes that humans exercising that on the behalf of God will never be perfect at it, and will always be subject to the temptation of corruption of power. And therefore, Jewish law continually says the poor are special in God's eyes. And over again, when Israel failed and things came apart at the seams, it was because an elite class had structured things in such a way that they had virtually turned all the agrarian people into serfs. Even Solomon almost pretty much accomplished that. Wasn't cheap building his big kingdom and all his armies and chariots and fortresses, etc., and maintaining 1,000 wives. God, think of a bill at Macy's. So, justice was expected in most of human history of civilization. What emanated from somebody who had pretty much absolute power. And they thought that reflected God as well. Pharaohs and emperors and Dalai Lamas and on and on and on. And this isn't reflections on the people. It's just the sense that the way the world should be structured is in this absolutist up-down way. And yet the Jewish call for some kind of equality of person, rich and poor before the law, rich and poor before the merchant. Don't put your thumb on the scale, he says. James brings it back. Now, I want to tell, did I tell you the story when I used to work for an international aid and development ministry, and I went to preach at St. Luke's in San Antonio, Texas. Have I told this story? Oh, good. Because it's a big parish with a lot of well-to-do people, big school. I mean, it's a very active, vibrant, urban, big parish, but fairly modern, not an old one. And my job was to go preach and tell about Cross International and try to solicit donors to join the cause. And I was invited to speak there, and got there, and usually I said, can I pick the lessons? And they said, no, here's the lessons. And guess what? The lesson for me to preach on is, who is it? Let's see, where is it? It says, so who is it that dishonors the poor? Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Isn't it not they who blaspheme the excellent name? And then there's another part of in James where it says, and the rich are withholding wages from the poor. And I mean, James just hammers and hammers the rich. And I got the worst passage in James towards the rich to preach on to all these wealthy people to try to get them maybe to give them some money. And I think the gospel was probably, Jesus said, where your money is, that's where your heart will be. It was like, oh my gosh. So the only way I knew how to address that was to stand, is when I got up in this high pulpit, and there's a lot of people, is to say, well, that was kind of rough, wasn't it? Because guess what? I've been in your parking lot. I've seen the cars you drive. And if you aren't feeling a little irritated with the lessons today, you didn't listen. But then I said this. I said, wealth and poverty is generally based on which direction you're looking. If I look up, I'm looking at people who have a lot more than me, bigger houses, better cars, more money in the bank, big, all the way up to the ultra billionaires. And I could say, man, I'm poor. I can't afford a bicycle. But if I look down and get a little more global than my neighborhood, I start to discover, and this is what I said to them, I said that I am a middle-class Episcopal clergyman and I'm one of the wealthiest men in the world. I am one of the wealthiest people in the world. So, in times of trouble or grief or feeling like there's not enough or that money is the issue, we need to remember that we have been given a wealth, not only of material comfort, the wealth of a justice system that evolved through centuries and centuries of missteps and not very just and corruption and everything else. But yet I have some confidence that if I were done wrong by somebody wealthier than me, that I might be able to get redress in a court of law that would make me equal to him. Do you see how important our faith stance is? Because all of this comes from one simple phrase in the first chapter of Genesis, in which he said, and he made man, male and female, he made them. In his own image, he made them. In that phrase, our faith heritage made us divine creatures. What do I mean by divine? Divine is the hawk that flew off the cross this morning. I saw it swoop. Frank and I ran to the window and looked out, and that hawk had some furry creature who was meeting his doom. Now, was that just? Was that the powerful afflicting the weak? Well, it might be a metaphor for that, but hawks and mice have evolved in such a way as to keep each other fed and in balance, because if there's too many mice, they eat all their food and then they starve. It is a biologically, ecologically balanced relationship that is not moral or amoral. It just is. It is how it is. But human beings are divine because we can choose not to go off that cross and grab some little poor thing and crush it. Our faith does not allow that kind of behavior in any form. And I can go all political, but I did that last week. I lost my mind. But close to home. These are some of this comes from my own regrets. This is why grandparents are so great with kids, is because they made all the mistakes already on their kids. They're good with the grandkids. And it's because I know mercy. And I'm much more tolerant of their play. And I'm much more aware of how powerful I am as an adult with some little kid. And that if I abuse that power, whether it be to shame, I had to fire an acolyte director once because he shamed child for wearing tennis shoes on the day he had to acolyte. I fired the director and told the kid if that's what he came to church in, tennis shoes were okay. Because guess what? It's not just for an old big person to land on a little kid about something that, his parents put him in the car with the tennis shoes on. Right? So whether it's the horrible kinds of abuse and sexual abuse, or whether it's just simply dumping on kids because they're weaker than us, that's oppression. If a man, and I would say in our culture, a woman, one of a couple, begin to demand always that all things be their way, and they use whatever force of persuasion is required. Maybe there's alcohol and drugs. If somebody's hitting somebody, that's oppression. And it's unjust. You see? Trying to get it on your neighbor. I used to be a freight broker. It's a job in which it's pure commission, and so there's a lot of scoundrels in it. You're always begging, borrowing, and trying to get somebody to do something so you can make some money. But I would watch people take advantage, and it would always bother me. And they'd say, man, this is how you make your money. But it felt like oppression to me. It felt like my thumb on the scale to me. So what I want to say to you is that we are a people, when it says be doers of the faith, we've got a lot of direction. That's not just an abstract try to figure it out thing. I mean, my Lord, by the time we go through the Ten Commandments, by the time we go through the prophets, by the time we look at the words of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain and the parables in John, when we look at all these stories, even this story of Jesus where he acts like a racist. How did that get in the New Testament with all this good stuff? Well, I don't know if Jesus really said it or not, but for Mark, he put it in there because he expressed the racism of his own culture. The distinction between being the chosen ones of God, the Jews, and these unclean pagans who are not even worthy of conversation. In this one story, Jesus does away with all that. He says, oh my gosh, you're right. You still need something. You still get fed. Something clicked in Jesus' head, and he said, you've said enough. You get what you wanted. Because it wasn't even for her, it was for her daughter. It's done for you. Ruined Jesus' vacation on the beach up by Tyre in Lebanon. That's where we were talking about. He left because he was tired and wanted to be alone, go to the beach. And this, So it's a life of ministry, and he went back into the fray, but he went back in different than he came in. You see, Jesus didn't know everything from the time he was born, or he wasn't human. Jesus hadn't learned every lesson of human interaction and every subtlety of human culture, life, law, and everything else, because he only ever lived as a Jew in the first century, occupied by Romans. So he knew the Greco-Roman culture, and he knew his own. And he had to learn. He had to learn. Even Jesus had to learn to live into the fullness of what God intends for us as human beings. If that's a heresy, talk to me after. So what I want to say to you is that our faith is not, and this is a huge mistake, centuries of mistake, building Christianity as a set of beliefs rather than a set of actions and principles. So that's what we get here. What is the real principle that goes all the way through from start to finish? It is that we all stand equal before God, and if we don't look at others as divine creatures, we have entered into sin. We've entered into separation because we're separating ourselves from an image of the divine. We're saying this color people, we don't want their reflection of the divine. It makes us scared. This group over here, their understanding and reflection of the divine just looks like a bunch of gobbledygook to me. I don't want to be around them. Those people don't believe anything. They're nuts. You see, I can distinguish us right down to there's no unity left in humankind whatsoever. And we will destroy ourselves. So the church is one place in our culture where people still call each other into accountable community, loving community, equal treatment community, equal before God community. If we don't proclaim it, if we don't proclaim that possibility, if we don't proclaim the roots of justice that come from our faith, who's going to preserve it? What reason would they have? What moral code would push them into it? We matter, humble and insignificant as we may feel or seem. The gospel and the message of the just and merciful God still matters. That's the important thing today.